My name is Richard. I'm in my late 30s, and for most of my adult life, I've been the kind of person people don't notice until they need something. I work in an office environment. Nothing glamorous, nothing dramatic on the surface. The kind of place where calendars are full, coffee is always lukewarm, and everyone smiles just enough to seem polite. If you asked my colleagues how they saw me back then, they'd probably say I was steady, quiet, dependable, the guy who never caused trouble, the one who didn't complain, didn't gossip, didn't take up too much space in meetings. I wasn't the loudest voice in the room, and I wasn't trying to be. I believed, honestly believed, that if you showed up, did your work well, and treated people fairly, that would be enough. This story isn't about revenge. It's not about exposing villains or painting myself as a hero. It's about something much quieter, and in some ways, much more unsettling. It's about the moment I realized the entire office was freezing me out. Not because I failed at my job, not because I hurt anyone, but because I refused to contribute to something everyone pretended didn't exist. They didn't call it corruption. They didn't call it extortion. They didn't even call it mandatory. They called it helping out. A black fund. Unspoken, undocumented, and somehow completely normal to everyone except me. At first, nothing obvious happened. No arguments, no raised voices, no threats, just small changes. Meetings I used to be invited to stopped appearing on my calendar. Messages I sent were read, but never answered. Friendly faces turned neutral, then cold, like someone had quietly turned down the temperature in the room and waited to see if I'd notice. And for a while, I told myself I was imagining it. What follows is the honest account of how that realization unfolded. Not all at once, but slowly. How silence became louder than confrontation. How being ignored taught me more than being insulted ever could. And how choosing not to react, at least not the way they expected, changed the entire balance of power without a single dramatic scene. This is a story about social pressure, about invisible rules, and about what happens when you quietly refuse to participate in a system built on mutual pretending. It's also about patience, about watching carefully instead of speaking quickly, and about the kind of strength that doesn't announce itself. I'm telling this now not to settle scores, but to document something many people experience and rarely talk about. Because if you've ever felt a room go cold for reasons no one will admit out loud, you know how isolating that can be. Before we go any further, let me ask you something. Have you ever felt people pulling away from you, not because you were wrong, but because you wouldn't go along? To understand what happened later, you need to understand who I was to them before anything went wrong, or at least before anyone admitted it had. In the office, I occupied a strange middle ground. I wasn't new, but I wasn't part of the inner circle either. I'd been there long enough to know the systems, the unspoken rhythms of the place. The way certain names carried weight in meetings, while others faded into the background. Mine was one of the names that faded. People described me as reliable, which sounds like a compliment until you realize it often means predictable and replaceable. I was the one managers trusted to clean up complicated processes, to stay late when something broke, to hand over clean reports without asking for credit. When deadlines were tight, my inbox filled up. When praise was being handed out publicly, it somehow never reached me. I didn't resent that at first. I told myself this was how real work looked. Quiet, unseen, necessary. I believed professionalism meant not needing applause. So I kept my head down, spoke when I had something precise to say, and avoided office politics as if they were a contagious disease. In meetings, I usually sat slightly off-center, notebook open, listening more than I talked. When I did speak, people nodded, sometimes even took notes, but the conversation always drifted back to louder voices. If I stopped contributing, no one asked why. If I did contribute, it was absorbed without acknowledgement, like background noise that helped the room function, but didn't need to be named. Socially, I was tolerated. People were polite. They asked about my weekend in the lift. They smiled in the hallway, but invitations never extended beyond the surface. After-work drinks happened without me. Group chats existed that I wasn't part of. I found out about birthdays after the cake had already been cut. Again, I didn't take it personally. Or rather, I trained myself not to. I told myself that offices are ecosystems, and not everyone is meant to be a visible species. Some of us are structural. We hold things up quietly. There was also an assumption attached to me, one I didn't fully recognize at the time, because I didn't push back, because I didn't draw lines loudly. People assumed I didn't have any, that I would always adapt, always absorb discomfort, always choose harmony over friction. Looking back, I can see how carefully that role was built around me, not through cruelty, but through habit. Through small decisions repeated often enough to become invisible. I was useful, and usefulness is dangerous when it becomes your only identity. What's important is this: before the Black Fund, before the silence, before the coldness, I already existed on the margins, not excluded exactly, just uncentered, easy to overlook, easy to pressure quietly. And when a system depends on everyone agreeing without speaking, the people on the margins are always the first test. At the time, though, I didn't see myself as someone being tested. I saw myself as someone doing his job, keeping his integrity intact, and trusting that would be enough. It took a while to understand how wrong that assumption was. The first time something felt wrong, it was so minor, I almost laughed at myself for noticing it. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday morning, one of those days where nothing stands out: gray sky, familiar routine, the quiet hum of computers coming to life. I arrived a little earlier than usual, coffee in hand, and opened my calendar to prepare for the week. That's when I noticed it. A meeting I'd always been part of was missing. At first, I assumed it was a scheduling error. It wouldn't have been the first time, so I checked the shared calendar. The meeting was there. Same title, same time, same room, just not my name. I stared at the screen longer than I'd like to admit, trying to convince myself there was a rational explanation. Maybe the scope had changed. Maybe they didn't need operational input this time. Maybe it was an honest oversight. What made it stick, though, was how ordinary everyone acted about it. I walked past the meeting room later that morning. Through the glass walls, I could see the usual faces. People who relied on my reports, my forecasts, my process maps. Someone was presenting slides I'd helped build the week before. No one looked uncomfortable. No one glanced at the door as if expecting me. No one noticed I wasn't there. That was the first cut, small, clean, almost polite. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't even ask about it that day. I told myself it wasn't worth making noise over something so trivial, but a part of me, quiet, observant, made a note of it, not in my leather notebook, but in my mind. A few days later, something else happened. A message I sent to a colleague, someone I work closely with, went unanswered. Not unusual in itself. People get busy, but then another message followed, and another, all seen, no reply. When I finally caught them in the corridor, they smiled, said they'd been swamped, and promised to get back to me. Their tone was friendly, but their eyes didn't quite meet mine. The follow-up never came. Again, I rationalized it. I was very good at that. I told myself I was reading too much into normal workplace friction, that adulthood meant not needing constant validation, that silence didn't always mean something. But what unsettled me wasn't the events themselves. It was the pattern beginning to form. Each moment on its own was easy to dismiss. Together, they created a faint pressure, like a change in air density you feel before a storm, but can't yet see. The real turning point of this part came during a casual conversation near the coffee machine. Two colleagues were talking in low voices. When I approached, they stopped, not abruptly, just enough to be noticeable. One of them smiled and changed the subject to the weather. I remember nodding along, stirring my coffee, pretending I hadn't felt the shift. But inside, something tightened. Not anger, not fear, recognition. That was when I first sensed that something was happening without my consent, and without my participation. Still, I said nothing. I chose patience over reaction. I told myself that if there was a problem, it would surface naturally. That clarity always arrives eventually. What I didn't yet understand was this: the system didn't need me to agree. It only needed me not to object. And the first test of that silence had already begun. Once the first boundaries are crossed without resistance, the next ones come faster. After that Tuesday, the small exclusions didn't stop. They multiplied, but always just enough to remain deniable. If I mentioned a missed update, someone would say, "Oh, I thought you already knew." If I asked about a decision, I'd hear, "We assumed you were aligned." The language was smooth, almost considerate. Nothing you could quote as wrongdoing. And that's how disrespect survives in professional spaces, by being reasonable. I began to notice how often I was the last to find out about changes that directly affected my work. Processes I'd designed were modified without consultation. Timelines shifted, and I was expected to adjust silently. When something went wrong, eyes drifted toward me, not with accusation, but with expectation. Fix it. What made it more disorienting was how everyone else treated this as normal. No awkwardness, no apology. It was as if a memo had gone out redefining my place, and I was the only one who hadn't received it. I told myself I was being sensitive, that work environments evolve, that people don't owe you inclusion. I replayed moments in my head, searching for something I might have done wrong, some misstep, some unspoken offense. But there wasn't one, at least not in the way we usually understand it. The truth was simpler and harder to accept. I was being trained to accept less, and I was cooperating. Every time I swallowed the discomfort, every time I chose not to ask, not to challenge, the new normal settled in a little deeper. Silence became my default response, not because I was afraid, but because I believed professionalism meant endurance. There was also a quieter fear underneath it all, the fear of being labeled difficult, of becoming that guy. Offices have long memories for dissenters, and I'd seen what happened to people who disrupted the surface calm. They didn't get fired, they just stalled. Opportunities dried up, influence evaporated. So I adapted. I spoke less. I documented more. I double-checked everything. I became even more precise, even more reliable, as if excellence could compensate for erasure. What I didn't realize at the time was that this adaptation was being interpreted very differently. To them, my silence wasn't dignity, it was consent. My patience wasn't strength, it was availability. The Black Fund still hadn't been mentioned to me directly, not yet, but the pressure around it was already doing its work. This was the conditioning phase, the part where you're taught what happens when you don't fall in line, without anyone ever saying that's what's happening. There were days I went home feeling oddly exhausted, even though nothing dramatic had happened. No conflicts, no crises, just the cumulative weight of being slightly diminished over and over again. And still, I stayed quiet. Not because I didn't feel the disrespect, but because I was still hoping it was temporary. It wasn't until much later that I understood something crucial. I hadn't been excluded by accident. I had been assigned a role. Every workplace has them. Not official titles, but social ones. The influencer, the gatekeeper, the enforcer. And then there's the one no one talks about, the absorber. The person who takes on friction so others don't have to. The one who makes things work quietly, without asking who benefits. That was me. Asaawi. I started to see it in the way requests came my way. Never framed as demands, always as assumptions. You can handle this, right? You're good with these things. It shouldn't take you long. The tone was friendly, but the pattern was unmistakable. At the same time, my authority, such as it was, began to erode. Decisions that once required my sign-off were made without me. My name disappeared from email threads, where it had always been present. When I raised concerns, they were acknowledged, and then gently ignored. What made this role assignment so effective was that it relied on my own values. I believed in fairness, in not making things personal, in contributing without keeping score. They didn't need to pressure me aggressively, they just leaned on who I already was. And then came the first indirect mention of the fund. It wasn't presented as a demand or even a policy. It surfaced in conversation the way gossip does, half joking, half serious. Someone mentioned everyone chipping in to smooth things over with external partners. Another person laughed and said, "That's just how things get done here." No one looked at me when they said it, but I felt the expectations settle in the room. I didn't respond. I asked neutral questions later, privately. What was it for? How was it managed? Who decided how it was used? The answers were vague. Don't worry about it. It's always been this way. You don't want to be the only one not contributing. That last sentence stayed with me, because suddenly everything made sense. The missed meetings, the unanswered messages, the subtle withdrawal of warmth. I wasn't being punished for incompetence. I was being nudged, quietly, persistently, toward compliance. My role wasn't to decide, it was to fall in line. And when I didn't, when I continued doing my work without opening my wallet or my silence to that system, the role tightened around me. I was still useful, but no longer included, still necessary, but no longer respected. There was no confrontation, no ultimatum, just a clear, unspoken message: participation buys belonging. That was the moment I realized this wasn't about money. It was about control, about testing who could be counted on to comply without needing to be asked twice. I went home that night and sat with that realization longer than I'd expected. Not angry, not yet, just clear. Because once you see the role you've been assigned, you have a choice: perform it, or step out of it entirely. The shift didn't happen during an argument. There was no confrontation, no dramatic exchange, no moment where I finally stood up for myself in the way movies like to portray. It happened quietly, almost invisibly. It was late afternoon, the kind of hour where the office feels half asleep. Most people were still at their desks, but mentally already gone. I was reviewing a report, one of those documents that touch several departments, the kind that quietly held things together. I noticed an inconsistency, a small one, the kind I would normally flag immediately, fix, and send back polished. I hovered over the keyboard, and then I stopped. Not because I was angry, not because I wanted to make a point, but because, for the first time, I asked myself a different question. Not what's expected of me, but what do I actually owe here? The answer surprised me with its simplicity. I owed accuracy. I owed professionalism. I did not owe invisibility. So instead of fixing it silently, I documented it. Carefully, neutrally. I noted when the data had changed, who had access, who had approved the revision. I sent a concise message asking for clarification before proceeding. The reply didn't come. An hour passed, then two. The office slowly emptied, still nothing. Normally, I would have stayed late, resolved it myself, and sent an update so no one else had to think about it. That evening, I shut down my computer on time and went home. That was the moment something shifted, not in the office, but in me. At home, I didn't replay conversations or imagine confrontations. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt calm, clear, as if I'd finally stopped leaning into a headwind I hadn't known was there. Over the following days, I repeated the behavior, not dramatically, not defensively, just deliberately. I stopped filling in gaps that existed because others had chosen to exclude me. I stopped anticipating needs that were never communicated. I responded professionally, but only within the boundaries of my actual role. And something interesting happened. The silence around me didn't lessen, but it changed. It became heavier, less casual, as if people sensed a difference they couldn't quite name. No one accused me of anything. No one openly complained. But requests became more carefully worded. Messages included more people. My absence from meetings became harder to justify. When my name was attached to outcomes they suddenly had to explain. Still, no one said the real thing out loud. And that was when I understood the real power of the situation. They needed my quiet cooperation more than they needed my contribution to their fund. The moment I stopped compensating for a system that was excluding me, the system began to reveal its cracks. I didn't smile more. I didn't withdraw emotionally. I simply became precise. And precision, in an environment built on unspoken agreements, is deeply unsettling. There's a difference between being silent because you don't know what to say, and being silent because you've chosen not to speak. For a long time, my silence had been the first kind. Careful, defensive, designed to avoid friction. But after that quiet shift, it became something else entirely. Intentional, controlled, observant. I still showed up on time. I still did my work well. I still answered questions when they were asked directly. But I stopped offering myself preemptively. I stopped smoothing over rough edges that weren't mine to handle. I let pauses exist where I used to rush in. And those pauses did something remarkable. People began to misread them. In meetings where I was present, my lack of commentary made others uneasy. They'd glance my way after making a decision, as if waiting for confirmation that never came. When I asked questions, they were simple, factual, impossible to argue with, and often followed by silence from the room. What's the approval path for this change? Who's accountable if this timeline slips? Can you confirm that aligns with the last documented process? No accusations, no tone, just clarity. They answered when they could. When they couldn't, they moved on quickly, eager to escape the discomfort. To them, my restraint looked like passivity, like I was withdrawing, like I'd lost confidence. That misinterpretation worked in my favor. Behind the scenes, I was paying attention in a way I never had before. I noticed who avoided eye contact when the fun came up indirectly, who used humor to deflect, who suddenly became very busy when documentation was mentioned. I also noticed something else. Without my constant, quiet intervention, small problems began to surface. Minor delays, confusion over responsibilities, questions that used to land in my inbox started circulating unresolved. No one connected it to me, not consciously. They just felt a growing friction they couldn't name. And still, no one confronted me, because confrontation would require acknowledging the system, the fund, the pressure, the unspoken rule that everyone else had agreed to play by. So they waited. They watched. They assumed I would eventually fall back into line, that I'd get tired of the coldness, that I'd pay, or at least ask how. I did neither. Silence, when chosen, has weight. It forces other people to project their assumptions onto it. And the assumptions they made about me, that I was weak, that I was unsure, that I didn't realize what was happening, gave me exactly the space I needed, not to retaliate, to prepare. Because once you stop trying to be understood by people who benefit from misunderstanding you, something opens up. Time, focus, leverage. They thought my quiet meant I was fading. In reality, I was finally standing still long enough to see the whole structure clearly. What they never noticed was that I had stopped reacting and started observing. When you're busy trying to prove your value, you miss patterns. When you stop trying, those patterns become impossible to ignore. My days grew quieter on the surface, but internally, they were sharper than they'd ever been. I wasn't detached, I was attentive. I began to document everything, not obsessively, not emotionally, but methodically, meeting invites I wasn't included in, but was later expected to support. Decisions communicated after the fact. Requests that assumed prior knowledge I hadn't been given. I recorded dates, times, phrasing, nothing dramatic, just facts. The leather notebook I'd carried for years finally found its real purpose. At the same time, I reviewed policies I'd never paid much attention to before. Expense approvals, vendor engagement rules, governance frameworks everyone claimed to follow, but rarely referenced. I didn't assume wrongdoing, I verified alignment. And that's when the gaps became visible. There were inconsistencies between what was documented and what was practiced. Gray areas that relied heavily on trust and silence. Processes that worked only if no one asked too many questions, especially about money that moved without receipts, approvals that existed informally, and decisions justified retroactively. The fund itself still lived in euphemisms, helping things along, keeping relationships warm. Off-book, but necessary. No emails, no spreadsheets, just expectations passed person to person like folklore. I never asked about it directly again. Instead, I mapped the environment around it. Who benefited when certain vendors were favored? Who had the authority to approve exceptions? Who always seemed relaxed when compliance was mentioned, and who suddenly became cautious? Patterns emerged slowly, but they were consistent. What surprised me most was how little attention anyone paid to my shift in behavior. They were so certain of the role I'd been assigned that they didn't question it when I stopped performing it fully. They assumed I was disengaging, or sulking, or quietly looking for another job. In a way, that assumption protected me. I also began to understand my own leverage, not as a threat, but as a fact. I knew the systems deeply. I understood where dependencies lived, which reports fed which decisions, what broke if timelines slipped, what questions external auditors would ask if they ever looked closely. I didn't create vulnerabilities. I simply acknowledged the ones that already existed. And here's the part that mattered most. I didn't feel excited by any of this. No rush, no sense of victory, just clarity, a calm understanding that the situation was no longer one-sided. They believed power came from inclusion, from being part of the inner circle, from knowing the unspoken rules. What they never noticed was that power also comes from understanding the system better than the people who rely on it staying invisible. I wasn't planning revenge. I wasn't plotting exposure. I was preparing for a decision I hadn't yet made, but knew was coming. Because once you see the full shape of something, you can't unsee it. And sooner or later, you have to choose what to do with that knowledge. The reveal didn't come with shock or adrenaline. It arrived the way truth usually does, quietly, after you've already done most of the work. I was reviewing a routine document late one evening, not because anyone had asked me to, but because it sat at the intersection of several processes I'd been tracking. Vendor approvals, expense routing, and a set of special arrangements that were always explained verbally but never written down. On its own, the document was harmless, boring even, but when I laid it next to the notes I'd been keeping for weeks, something aligned. A pattern snapped into focus. Certain expenses were consistently categorized in ways that avoided secondary review. Certain vendors were paid just under thresholds that would have triggered additional oversight. The timing matched the same projects where people casually joked about keeping things smooth or taking care of it the usual way. And suddenly, the black fund wasn't abstract anymore. It wasn't a pile of cash in a drawer. It was a behavior. A system of small choices designed to never look like a system at all, one that depended entirely on mutual silence and plausible deniability. What struck me wasn't the scale, it wasn't dramatic. What struck me was the fragility. The entire structure only worked if everyone played their part and no one documented too much, including me. I sat back and didn't touch the keyboard for a long time. There was no sense of triumph, no urge to confront anyone, just a steady, almost sobering clarity. The coldness I had experienced wasn't personal, it was procedural. I had stepped outside the agreement without formally declaring it, and the system had responded by isolating me. That isolation, ironically, had given me distance, and distance had given me sight. I realized then that I didn't need to accuse anyone. I didn't need to expose or threaten. The leverage wasn't in what I could say, it was in what I now understood. I also realized something else. This wasn't a matter of catching people out. It was about deciding who I wanted to be once I knew the truth. Because knowledge like this creates responsibility, not legal responsibility, moral responsibility. The kind that doesn't announce itself, but changes how you move through the world. I closed the document, saved my notes, and did nothing else that night. No messages, no calls, no dramatic conclusions. Just a quiet acceptance that the situation had crossed an invisible line, and that whatever came next would be irreversible. Some doors, once opened, don't slam shut. They simply stop pretending they were ever closed. Knowing something and acting on it are very different experiences. For a while, I lived in the space between them. I went to work, as usual. I spoke when spoken to. I maintained the same calm, professional tone. On the surface, nothing changed. Internally, everything had. Once you see the full mechanism of a system like that, your options narrow quickly. I spent days, quiet days, mentally laying them out, not emotionally, but logically. The first option was the easiest. Comply. Contribute to the fund. Buy my way back into warmth and inclusion. It would have worked. I had no doubt about that. The coldness would have thawed almost immediately. Meetings would reappear. Messages would get replies. Smiles would return. But I also knew what compliance would cost me. Not money, identity. Once you participate in a system that survives on silence, you lose the right to ever speak freely about it again. You become invested in its continuation, bound to it. That option closed itself. The second option was confrontation, calling it out, demanding transparency, forcing the conversation into the open. On paper, it sounded principled. In reality, it was naive. Systems like this don't collapse when exposed abruptly. They redirect pressure. They isolate the disruptor, label them as unstable or disloyal, and carry on slightly more carefully. I had watched that happen to others in different contexts. Loud resistance creates an easy target. The third option was to leave quietly. Find another job, walk away clean, preserve my integrity and my peace. For a while, this option tempted me the most. There is dignity in choosing distance. But every time I leaned toward it, something stopped me. Leaving would resolve my discomfort, but it would also erase the truth I now carried. The system would continue unchanged. The next person in my role would inherit the same expectations, the same pressure, the same invisible test. I realized then that this decision wasn't about winning or losing. It was about alignment. Who did I want to be when this chapter ended? The answer came not as a feeling, but as a certainty. I would not comply. I would not confront emotionally, and I would not vanish. I chose the option that required the most patience and the least noise. I would move in silence, legally, professionally, irreversibly. Not to punish anyone, not to expose secrets publicly, but to remove myself, step by step, from the position that made the system comfortable, to stop being the stabilizing weight that allowed it to function unnoticed. It wasn't dramatic. There was no internal speech. Just a calm understanding that from this point forward, every action I took would be deliberate, and none of them would be explained in advance. Once that decision was made, I slept better than I had in months. Because clarity, even when it leads somewhere difficult, is a form of relief. Once the decision was made, everything slowed down, in the best possible way. I didn't rush. I didn't act out of emotion. I treated what came next the way I treated complex systems at work, carefully, sequentially, with an understanding of downstream effects. Silence wasn't avoidance anymore. It was method. The first thing I did was inventory my responsibilities, not just what was written in my job description, but what I actually carried. Over the years, I had become a junction point. Information passed through me. Processes relied on my timing. People assumed I'd be there to translate ambiguity into action. None of that was formalized. That mattered. I began by aligning myself strictly with documented scope. If a task wasn't assigned through the proper channel, I didn't refuse it. I asked for it to be formalized, politely, neutrally, in writing. Requests that used to arrive casually, over chat, in passing, through implication, suddenly had to travel through official paths. Some of them never arrived at all. Next, I standardized my outputs. Reports that had once included helpful context, verbal explanations, and anticipatory fixes became precise and complete, but no longer interpretive. I stopped connecting dots for people. I delivered exactly what was requested, no more, no less. It sounds small, it wasn't. The system they'd built depended on people like me smoothing transitions. Removing that lubrication didn't cause a crash, but it did introduce friction, enough to be noticed, not enough to blame. At the same time, I reviewed my own exposure. I consulted policies, not to weaponize them, but to protect myself. Conflict of interest guidelines, whistleblowing procedures, data handling standards. I didn't file anything. I didn't escalate. I simply made sure that if anyone ever questioned my conduct, it would be boringly defensible. There's a particular kind of confidence that comes from knowing you are fully aligned with the rules everyone else only gestures toward. Financially, I detached. Any expense, reimbursement, or approval connected even tangentially to the informal system was declined or redirected, politely, with reference to policy. I became the least convenient person to route gray area decisions through. No speeches, no lectures, just consistency. I also began transferring knowledge, selectively, formally. Where I had once been the keeper of institutional memory, I started documenting processes in shared spaces, not all at once, gradually, enough that no single failure would look intentional. This part required patience. If you move too quickly, people notice. If you move too slowly, nothing changes. I treated it like easing weight off a structure that had learned to lean on me. What fascinated me most was how invisible all of this remained. People sensed change, but they couldn't locate it. They felt delays, confusion, an odd lack of cohesion. Meetings ran longer, decisions circled without landing, questions that used to resolve themselves lingered, and still no one said my name, because saying my name would require asking why things felt different, and asking why would lead too close to answers no one wanted to articulate. I was also careful not to overplay my hand emotionally. I stayed polite, calm, almost pleasant. I didn't withdraw socially more than necessary. I didn't correct people publicly. I didn't express frustration. That restraint did something unexpected. It disarmed suspicion. If I had seemed bitter, angry, or disengaged, it would have been easy to attribute the friction to me personally. But I wasn't any of those things. I was simply exact. Exact people are hard to argue with. Behind the scenes, I also prepared for independence, not escape, optionality. I updated my credentials, reconnected quietly with former colleagues in other organizations, took exploratory conversations that asked nothing of me and promised nothing in return. Not because I planned to leave immediately, but because leverage is always stronger when it's unused. Weeks passed, then months. The Black Fund still existed. I knew that, but its movement slowed. Not because I had attacked it, but because the environment around it had changed. Transactions took longer. Justifications became clumsier. The confidence that came from unquestioned routine began to erode. People started compensating in subtle ways. More meetings, more emails, more just checking in. They were working harder to achieve outcomes that used to feel effortless. All of this happened without confrontation. That's the thing people misunderstand about quiet dominance. It's not about control, it's about removing dependency. When you stop being the silent pillar holding something up, the structure doesn't collapse, it reveals itself. And in that revelation, people start making mistakes, not out of malice, but out of unfamiliarity with operating without you. I watched all of it with the same calm I'd cultivated from the beginning, because by then, the outcome no longer mattered as much as the alignment. I had moved, they hadn't noticed, but the consequences were already in motion. The first consequence wasn't panic. It was confusion, not the dramatic kind, no raised voices, no emergency meetings, but a subtle, spreading disorientation, the kind that shows up as longer email threads, duplicated work, and questions that keep getting forwarded because no one is quite sure who owns them anymore. I noticed it in small ways at first. A report request came back to me with slightly altered wording, as if the sender was trying to be extra careful. A meeting invite included more people than necessary, almost offensive in its inclusivity. Someone asked me to sanity check a decision I'd had no involvement in, their tone polite but uncertain. They were feeling the absence before they understood its source. What had changed wasn't my workload, it was my function. I was no longer absorbing uncertainty, and uncertainty, when left unabsorbed, has a way of circulating until it becomes visible. Projects began to stall, not dramatically, but just enough to be irritating. Timelines slipped by days instead of hours. Decisions that once moved forward on quiet confidence now required validation, then revalidation. People started asking for things in writing that they used to handle with a nod and a wink. No one said it out loud, but I could sense the question forming in the background. Why does everything feel harder lately? The fund was still unspoken, but its shadow grew heavier. Without the usual ease, without someone smoothing edges, reclassifying things neatly, or anticipating objections, the informal system became clumsy, not illegal, just exposed. People who had once been relaxed began to show tension. You could see it in their posture during meetings, in the way jokes landed a little flat. They checked their words more carefully. They glanced around before speaking, as if the room itself had become less trustworthy. And then came the first quiet blame. Not directed at me, not yet, but at each other. I overheard it in fragments. "I thought you were handling that. That's not how we usually do it. We never had this issue before." That last sentence came up a lot. I wanted to smile when I heard it. I didn't. Because this wasn't about being missed. It was about something more structural. They weren't missing me. They were missing the version of the system that existed when someone else carried the risk invisibly. What surprised me was how long it took for anyone to connect the dots. People are very good at protecting their assumptions. They looked everywhere except at the quietest variable in the room. They attributed the friction to workload, to external pressure, to one of those quarters. Anything but the possibility that someone had stepped out of alignment. In the meantime, my own position became strangely stable. Because I was no longer overextended, nothing I did could be framed as a failure. My outputs were clean. My communication was precise. My boundaries were documented. If anything went wrong, it was clear where my responsibility ended. That clarity unsettled people. There's comfort in ambiguity when it allows blame to slide around unnoticed. Once things become explicit, accountability sharpens, and not everyone welcomes that. I started receiving more check-in messages. Casual, friendly, slightly forced. Just wanted to see how things are going. Hope you're doing all right. Let me know if you need anything. None of them mentioned the fund. None of them mentioned exclusion, but the warmth felt transactional, as if they were testing whether the old version of me might still respond. I remained polite, cordial, unavailable in the ways that mattered. The second wave of consequences came when external pressure increased. An audit request, routine, scheduled. Nothing alarming on its own, but audits have a way of magnifying informal practices. Questions get asked, documentation gets reviewed, assumptions get tested. I wasn't involved in the audit directly. That was important. I had made sure of it, but I was adjacent enough to hear the tension in conversations, to notice how often my name almost came up and didn't. People scrambled to align narratives, to make sure explanations matched, to remember which version of how things are done applied to which audience. That's when the first real anxiety surfaced. Because systems built on silence don't break under scrutiny, they fray, they stretch, they require constant adjustment, and adjustment requires coordination. Coordination requires trust. Trust was thinning. I watched colleagues who used to move confidently begin to hesitate. People deferred decisions they once made instinctively. The easy authority some of them carried started to wobble, not visibly, but internally. And still, no one confronted me, not because they didn't suspect, but because suspicion, without proof, is dangerous. To ask me directly would mean acknowledging the possibility that I'd stepped outside the agreement, and that acknowledgement alone could destabilize everything. So they waited. They hoped the friction would resolve itself, that I'd get tired of being peripheral, that I'd come back into the fold voluntarily. Instead, the consequences kept unfolding. One project was delayed just enough to trigger a review, not a crisis, just an inquiry. Questions were asked about process adherence, about decision trails, about approval logic. Answers were given, carefully, confidently, but without the old ease. Another initiative lost momentum because two departments couldn't agree on who had final authority. Normally, I would have clarified it in 10 minutes. This time, it took weeks. People began working longer hours, not because there was more work, but because there was more uncertainty, and uncertainty is exhausting. I noticed fatigue in their voices, irritation in meetings, a subtle edge that hadn't been there before. They weren't angry at anyone in particular. They were angry at the situation. That's the thing about quiet withdrawal. It redirects stress back to its source. I wasn't creating consequences. I was allowing them. And as those consequences accumulated, something else happened. The social coldness toward me softened, but not into warmth, into caution. People no longer ignored me. They acknowledged me carefully. They looped me in more deliberately, as if proximity itself had become strategic. Not friendly, strategic. They were recalibrating. But recalibration without honesty only goes so far, because by this point, the damage wasn't emotional, it was structural. And structures, once they start to strain, don't return to their old shape just because everyone wishes they would. They require change, or collapse, and everyone could feel that a threshold was approaching, even if no one wanted to say it out loud. By the time people realized something was wrong, they were already asking the wrong question. They weren't asking what changed. They were asking how to make it go back. That distinction mattered more than they understood. The atmosphere in the office shifted again, but this time it wasn't cold, it was restless. Conversations happened behind closed doors more often. Calendar blocks appeared without context. People who used to be decisive became strangely tentative, as if every choice carried an invisible risk they couldn't quite define. The system was no longer running smoothly, and now everyone could feel it. The first real attempt to fix things came disguised as concern. A senior colleague stopped by my desk one afternoon. Casual posture, friendly tone, the kind of visit that pretends to be spontaneous but is clearly rehearsed. "Just wanted to check in," they said. "Feels like things have been off lately." I nodded, neutral, inviting them to continue. They talked for a while without saying anything concrete, about workload, about pressure from above, about how we're all in this together. The language was inclusive, almost nostalgic. What they never mentioned was responsibility, or process, or transparency. They were fishing for reassurance, for cooperation, for the version of me who would quietly step back into place and absorb the tension. I listened, then I said something simple. "I've just been working to the documented process." That was it. No accusation, no defensiveness, just a statement of fact. The conversation ended shortly after. That's when the panic began, not openly, but unmistakably. Because working to the documented process is impossible to argue with without admitting you haven't been. After that, the attempts came more frequently and more clumsily. Sudden invitations to meetings I hadn't been part of in months. Requests for my input framed as collaboration, but clearly aimed at restoring the old flow. Compliments that felt oddly delayed, as if someone had finally remembered to say them. I accepted the meetings. I gave input when asked. I remained calm and professional, but I didn't resume my old role. I didn't anticipate problems for people who excluded me from the decision-making. I didn't translate ambiguity into certainty. I didn't volunteer solutions that would make uncomfortable questions disappear. And that's when they realized something critical. It wasn't just that things were harder. It was that they no longer knew how to fix them without acknowledging why they were broken. The fund, the unspoken glue that had smoothed so many interactions, became a liability instead of a convenience. Without the usual confidence, people grew hesitant about using it. Explanations felt thinner, justifications sounded rehearsed even to themselves. Some tried to quietly distance themselves from it. Others doubled down, insisting this was how things have always worked. Neither approach solved the problem, because the problem wasn't the fund. The problem was that the system depended on people like me staying quiet forever. And I wasn't quiet anymore, not in the way they needed. Pressure from above intensified. Leadership wanted clarity. Auditors wanted consistency. External partners wanted accountability. The same people who once dismissed documentation as bureaucratic now scrambled to produce it retroactively. You can't retroactively create trust. That's when blame finally sharpened. Still not openly, still not with names attached. But you could feel it in the way conversations stopped when certain people entered the room, in the subtle defensiveness that crept into emails, in the way colleagues started protecting themselves instead of each other. The unity that had once enforced silence began to fracture, and then came the moment that made it irreversible. A proposal circulated, meant to formalize certain practices, to bring things into alignment. On the surface, it looked like reform. In reality, it was an attempt to legitimize what had previously lived in the shadows, without acknowledging how it had functioned. They wanted my sign-off, not because they needed my approval, because they needed my silence attached to the new version. I read the proposal carefully, line by line. It was incomplete, vague where it mattered, carefully worded to protect everyone except the people who would be expected to carry the risk going forward. I declined to endorse it, politely, in writing, with specific references to policy gaps and accountability concerns. That was the moment they understood. Not emotionally, structurally. There was no way back to the old arrangement. No quiet conversation that could undo what had already been documented. No gesture of goodwill that could restore what depended on unspoken compliance. The system had reached the point where it could only survive by changing, or by sacrificing someone. And for the first time, it was clear that I would not be that someone. What they didn't yet realize was that the choice had already been made, not by me, by the consequences they'd allowed to accumulate. The confrontation, when it finally came, looked nothing like what people imagine. No closed-door ambush, no raised voices, no accusations laid bare on the table. It happened in a meeting room, with the blinds half open, and a printed agenda that pretended this was just another operational discussion. There were 4 of us, 2 senior managers, 1 representative from compliance, and me. I arrived on time, notebook in hand, calm, not guarded, just present. The tone was careful from the start, polite, almost overly respectful. They spoke about alignment, about recent friction, about the need to move forward constructively. Every sentence was designed to avoid naming the real issue, while circling it closely enough to feel its gravity. I listened without interrupting. Eventually, one of them paused and looked at me, not challengingly, but expectantly. They asked how I felt things had been going. I didn't mirror their language. I didn't soften my words to maintain comfort, but I didn't harden them either. I've been doing my work according to documented responsibilities and policies, I said. Where expectations are unclear, I've asked for clarification. That was all. The compliance representative shifted slightly in their chair. Another manager tried a different angle, more personal this time. They spoke about trust, about how teams function best when everyone feels supported, about how some things don't always fit neatly into procedures. I nodded. I agree, I said. That's why clarity matters. Informal systems place risk on individuals without protecting them. Silence followed, not awkward, heavy. No one disagreed, because disagreeing would require defending the indefensible out loud. They asked if I felt excluded. I considered the question carefully before answering. I've noticed changes in communication and inclusion, I said. I adjusted how I work in response. No blame, no emotion, just cause and effect. That was when something subtle happened. The dynamic shifted, not in my favor exactly, but out of their control. They weren't dealing with a grievance. They were dealing with a position. A manager asked what I wanted. The room leaned in, just slightly. I want clear processes, I said, transparent expectations, and to not be placed in situations where silence is treated as obligation. That was it. No demands, no threats, no ultimatums. They exchanged glances. They asked procedural questions. They took notes. The meeting ended with next steps, none of which required anything from me immediately. As we stood to leave, one of them said, almost reflexively, "We should have had this conversation earlier." I met their eyes and nodded once. Yes, I said, you should have. Not with bitterness, with finality. Because by the time a system forces a conversation like that, it's no longer about repair. It's about acknowledgement. And acknowledgement, when it comes too late, doesn't restore trust. It simply marks the end of denial. I didn't leave that meeting feeling victorious. I left it feeling finished. Not with my job, not immediately, not with the people, not entirely, but with a version of myself that had believed endurance was the same thing as integrity. In the weeks that followed, things stabilized on the surface. Processes were clarified. Communication became more formal. Certain practices quietly disappeared, replaced by something more defensible, more visible. No announcements, no apologies, just adjustment. People treated me differently after that, not warmly, not coldly, but carefully. I was no longer invisible, but I wasn't central either. I existed outside the old social gravity, and that was exactly where I wanted to be. What surprised me most was how little anger I felt. I'd expected resentment to linger, some urge to replay moments, to correct the past, to imagine better outcomes. None of that came. What replaced it was a grounded calm, a sense that I'd acted in alignment with myself, even when it would have been easier not to. I became more deliberate in every part of my life, not just work. I stopped over-explaining, stopped volunteering for roles that cost more than they gave back, stopped mistaking politeness for fairness. Professionally, my reputation shifted in subtle ways. I was seen as precise, principled, someone who didn't bend easily, but also didn't break. Opportunities came that were quieter but cleaner, conversations that were direct instead of political, and personally, something healed. The old fear of being invisible, of being left out, lost its power. I realized that invisibility only hurts when you're still trying to be seen by people who benefit from overlooking you. Once you stop seeking belonging from systems that demand silence as the price of entry, exclusion loses its sting. I didn't become louder. I didn't become harder. I became clearer. I know now that quiet dominance isn't about control or superiority. It's about self-respect that doesn't need an audience. It's about choosing alignment over approval, even when alignment costs you comfort in the short term. I still carry that leather notebook, not as armor, as a reminder that the most important shift doesn't happen when others change their behavior. It happens when you do. When I look back now, what stays with me isn't the discomfort, or even the isolation. It's how ordinary the whole thing was. No villains in dark rooms, no dramatic threats, just people doing what systems quietly teach them to do. Protect themselves, normalize shortcuts, and reward silence when it keeps things easy. For a long time, I thought the hardest part was being frozen out. The unanswered messages, the meetings I wasn't invited to, the subtle shift in how people looked at me, as if I'd become slightly inconvenient. But that wasn't the hardest part. The hardest part was realizing how easily I could have made it all stop if I'd been willing to betray something small but essential inside myself. That's the trade most systems like this rely on. They don't ask you to do something obviously wrong. They ask you to do something quietly wrong, and then reward you with comfort for not talking about it. Inclusion becomes conditional. Belonging becomes transactional. What I learned is this: silence isn't neutral. It's either chosen or it's extracted. When silence is extracted, it costs you something over time. It erodes clarity. It turns professionalism into self-erasure. And the longer it goes on, the harder it becomes to tell where the system ends and you begin. Quiet dominance isn't about winning against others. It's about refusing to lose yourself in order to stay comfortable. I didn't expose anyone publicly. I didn't burn bridges. I didn't even raise my voice. I simply stopped carrying weight that wasn't mine to carry, and let the consequences return to where they belonged. And that's the part people rarely talk about. You don't need to fight every system that's wrong. You don't need to announce your principles. Sometimes, the most powerful move is alignment, so consistent, so boringly ethical, that it forces reality to catch up. If you're listening to this and recognizing pieces of your own experience, the unspoken expectations, the pressure to just go along, the sense that something feels off but no one will name it, know this: you're not weak for noticing, you're not difficult for hesitating, and you're not alone for choosing integrity over comfort. The cost of quiet resistance is often paid up front. The cost of quiet compliance is paid forever. I'll leave you with one question, not to provoke, but to invite reflection. Have you ever been pushed towards silence in exchange for belonging? And if so, what did it cost you? If you feel comfortable, Share your thoughts in the comments. Sometimes, the most powerful thing we can do is say it out loud.
Cảm ơn bạn đã lắng nghe câu chuyện vừa rồi. Đừng quên like, share và bấm chuông để không bỏ lỡ câu chuyện mới nhất. Hẹn gặp lại.